Middle Podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers? It is time for another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck, and I am super stoked this week to welcome a friend of mine, and he's one of the people that I shared the time frame I'd referred to as peak Gen X. We've seen many indie rock, punk, hardcore shows together, discovered new bands together, watched many of the now classic movies from the era, and even started collecting our ink around the same time. So, welcome, Carlos Rivera, to the show. How are you, my man?
I'm doing all right, man. Glad to be on the show. I'm glad you asked me to come on in and chat with you.
No, it's awesome. So before we kind of get started, is kind of trying to timelines, right? From when I first met you, but just very quickly, because one of the things that we'll talk about, I had mentioned the punk and hardcore bands, and you're heavily influenced by New York, because you were born in New York. Right now, people can't see it. You're wearing a Yankees hat. So, to correct me if I'm wrong, you were born in New York, then moved with your family to Puerto Rico, and then moved back to Connecticut.
Almost. Yeah, I was born in New York. We lived in the Bronx until I was 3. And my dad, that was 77 when the blackout and the whole Son of Sam thing and the Bronx is burning thing was going on. So my dad, who had grown up in the Bronx, was born in the Bronx and grew up in the Bronx, was like, I have a family now. He didn't want his kids growing up in the Bronx. So we ended up moving to Baltimore. He was an engineer and he got a job working for Bethlehem Steel. So we moved to Baltimore in 77, lived there till 79. 79, moved to Bristol, Connecticut when he started working for General Electric. And in 1980, during my Christmas vacation from first grade, we moved to Puerto Rico. So I, got uprooted right in the middle of school and had to start a brand new school in the middle of the school year.
Wow.
So we were in Puerto Rico from 80 to 85, and then we moved to the humble abode that we both call home, which is Meriden, Connecticut.
Wow.
So yeah.
I didn't realize the other couple stops on the road. So, I mean, this was really early in your youth, but do you remember much of, Baltimore at all or just being there?
Yeah, Baltimore and New York is fuzzy. I do have some memories of New York, but most of my early memories are of Baltimore and going to Baltimore because we lived right on the outskirts. And so we'd go to Baltimore almost every weekend. I remember eating this Baltimore steamed crabs when I was younger and just really loving that. We went to some Baltimore Orioles games and we used to go to Washington, D.C. quite often because D.C. wasn't that far. So, I have some pretty interesting memories. And my parents used to play tennis at the time. And there was like a tennis court, several tennis courts just up the road from, because we lived in a townhouse. And I remember going to watch my parents play tennis. And knowing my parents, you can imagine how funny that must look in your head. just a
little bit. Yeah, it's just very interesting. Yeah. So for anyone, anyone who doesn't know Carlos, Carlos's dad is quite tall and Carlos's mom is quite small. And I can see them, were they doing doubles? They were on the same side?
That would have been even funnier. No, we're playing against each other. But so Baltimore, I have those are my early memories. And then obviously when we moved to Bristol, I was already getting ready to start kindergarten. So, I remember most of our time in Bristol. And it was tough moving, in first grade, having friends that I've known and gone to school with for, a year and a half and going to nursery school with them and everything. It was tough. And then Puerto Rico, I had been there before on vacation, but this was a whole new ball game. Like I was going to a private school there because at the time, and still the public schooling system in Puerto Rico is awful. It's bilingual now, but at the time it wasn't. And my parents did not want me to, I knew both English and Spanish, and they did not want me to forget English.
Interesting.
So part of the deal of my dad uprooting his family for 4.5 years was that General Electric was going to pay for his sons, because my brother was already born, to go to school at a private school, which was like the equivalent of like a Cheshire Academy. It was ridiculous. I hated it. I made good friends there, but I went to school. Let me put it this way. The first school I went to in Puerto Rico when I was from first grade to fourth grade, Roberto Clemente's youngest son, Luis, was a senior when I was in third grade. So that's the type of school I went to.
Wow.
It was full of diplomats, any well-known actor in Puerto Rico, their kids went to that school. And then in fifth grade, I ended up going to another private school because my mom was a teacher there and I was able to go for free. So General Electric was like, we're no longer paying for your son to go to at the time, it had to have been like, in the 80s, probably $12,000 a year to go, which, seeing that show, it's like $66,000 a year to go. The school is probably the same right now. So I went to another school. So again, after having friends from first grade through fourth grade, I got uprooted again and went to a different school for my fifth grade year. Luckily, I was able to make friends, wherever I went. You know me as a person, and I can every now and again be kind of shy, but most of the time I'm pretty open to meeting people. So I didn't have a hard time meeting people, but it was tough. It was tough growing up and getting uprooted like that. But in Puerto Rico is where I first started getting introduced to a lot of the music that I like, and punk and stuff. Not so much then. I'm not going to say I'm that cool. I wasn't listening to punk rock or New York hardcore in the 80s like that when I was in. But, most of my friends had older brothers and sisters. So the first Van Halen album I ever listened to was Mean Streets, and I remember being in my friend's house, and his brother had all these cassettes and stuff, and he put on Sinner's Swing, and it was like, oh, wow, man. They say the F word and everything, and this song. And so Van Halen, The Police, AC/DC, Ozzy, all that stuff I was introduced to, at an early age. And, and then whatever was on the radio. My parents listened to music all the time. I grew up listening to music. My parents collected, used to buy 45s and albums, 8 tracks, all that stuff. And so I was always in tune with music. But living in Puerto Rico, you would think I liked salsa and merengue and all that type. I really don't. If I'm dancing at a wedding or at something, I have no problem with it. But in Puerto Rico, you were either a cocolo, which is someone who listens to salsa and merengue, or you were a rockero, a rocker, someone who listened to rock and roll music. And if I had gone to a public school, I probably would have been more of a cocolo.
Interesting.
But going to private school, I had friends that were German from Germany that spoke English, German, and Spanish fluently.
Wow.
The oddest thing, but it was cool.
And they accept.
It was really cool.
And the Scorpions. Yes. So
yes, yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. So that was going to be one of my questions, and you went right for it, and I'm glad, because you knew what I was going to ask. What was on the radio in Puerto Rico? Because it seems to me, if there is a rock scene and there's an interest there, was it all the same stuff that was on stateside?
Yeah. Because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory and so many Americans lived there and still do, because the companies have moved, but back in the 80s, a lot of the big companies had plants over there, and so of course anything that was on the top 20, top 40 radio here in the States, there were a couple of stations in Puerto Rico. I don't remember offhand what the names of the radio stations are, but I mean, let me put it this way: in fifth grade, my first day of school, I'm going in with my mom. I eventually ended up. Well, in fifth grade, I went in every day with my mom. From first grade to fourth grade, I had to go on a van, and it sucked. But regardless, first day of fifth grade, I remember going in with my mom, and she had the radio on, and "Oh Sherrie" was one of the big songs. That was 84, I think, is when I was in fifth grade, 84 to 85. And "Oh Sherrie" was on, and I remember listening, and I knew who Journey were. I already had heard Journey at that point. And I remember getting to school, and my first day in class, this guy that sat right in front of me, his name was Udo. And he turned around to me, didn't even say hi or ask my name. He just turned around and was just like, "And it should have been go."
What? He just launched into "Oh Sherrie."
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I was like, dude, I just heard that. I was like, I just heard that on the radio. It's like, yeah, man. Journey, it's Steve Perry. So, even at a young age, music was an avenue to meeting people.
Yeah.
They say it's the universal language, man. I mean, you can be from different states, different countries, different islands, and music is something that most people can talk about. And it's kind of like an icebreaker, and so on the radio stations, like I remember when 1984 came out, I wish I had my old vinyl. I had that on vinyl. I bought that on vinyl. Even before that, my first vinyl that I ever bought with my own money was a compilation album that had "I Love Rock and Roll" on it, which, you know what? When you did that last week's podcast, that was the first time that I heard that was a cover song.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. And I'm
Arrows.
surprised that I didn't know that, man.
Yeah.
Like, that's shame on me. But, I bought that compilation album strictly for "I Love Rock and Roll" because that was a hot song back in 80, 81, something like that. I was pretty...
82. Yeah, that was 82.
So, when I was younger, I bought mostly vinyl, and it was the stuff that I was listening to on the radio or at my friends' houses. And the Police, whenever the album "With Every Breath You Take" came out, I remember my friends and I used to call the radio station to request that song. Quiet Riot, Mental Health, the first Quiet Riot album that is that.
Yeah. So that's interesting that you mentioned that, because Joan Jett, her biggest hit, "I Love Rock and Roll." Quiet Riot, cover. Slade, cover. And what's so interesting is that those bands weren't known in the States. So like these artists could go ahead and say, "That's a great song, I'm just going to do it." Huge hit. Which means that the original should have been a hit. They're all maybe minor UK hits, and that's about it. But Carlos, I mentioned the 8 tracks. Yep. But my first record. So this is a little bit of we were talking about different islands. My first album that I bought with my own money was Miami Sound Machine.
Nice. There's nothing wrong with a little Miami Sound Machine, though.
I loved Gloria Estefan. That whole record, man. Yeah. I freaking loved it. So I was not a rocker. Like, I enjoyed rock music, but at that time when I was buying my own stuff, it was all pop. It was Thriller, Miami Sound Machine, Prince, all that kind of stuff. Duran. That's what I was purchasing. I didn't get into rock until later. When I say got into rock, I mean the contemporary rock that was happening. Yeah, I liked Van Halen and that kind of stuff because I had already listened to them. But purchasing rock didn't happen till 86, probably 85, 86. Yeah. So all the stuff prior to that I was buying was all pop music.
And that's interesting. But at the same point, you also had your parents that liked that rock music. So I'm pretty sure you didn't even have to buy it at that point.
That's true.
My parents, them, they're not their rock and roll is the Beatles. They were into the Beatles. The 8 tracks they had were Billy Joel. They had the Rolling Stones, the